Joe Roman is a conservation biologist and researcher up at UVM. His research focuses on endangered species conservation and marine ecology, and it has appeared in too many journals for me to list. He's also quite the fellow and has a long list of fellowships. He's been to Brazil. He had a fellowship at Harvard, Duke University, the University of Iceland, and Radcliffe. And those are just the ones I found. I'm sure there's more that I don't even know about. He has presented his work in the U.S. Congress, South by Southwest, the International Monetary Fund, and the universities around the world. Coverage of his research has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, NPR, the BBC, and other outlets. So he's really smart. Or I was just today, he's smart. So he is the editor-in-chief in earthinvaders.org, which is a website dedicated to fighting invasive species one bite at a time. He's also got a good sense of humor. He also is the author of Listed, Dispatches from American Endangered Species Act, and he's got a Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award. And he's written for the Audubon, the New Scientist, the New York Times, Slate, and other publications. Holy cow, he is impressive. But here's my favorite part of the whole bio. He received his PhD from Harvard in '03 in organisms and evolutionary biology, and his master's degree in wildlife ecology and conservation from the University of Florida. He has worked along the coasts of Alaska, New England, the Canadian Maritimes, Brazil, Cuba, Iceborne, and Iceland. He was born and raised in New York, and he considers King Kong an early influence in conservation. So there you have it. So we all know how that went for King Kong, but I'm going to pass it over to Joe now. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for coming. And thank you, Renee, for that introduction. You stumbled on what I got my PhD on, and it was a couple of years ago. Someone introduced me and said I got my PhD in orgasmic and revolutionary biology. I'm still looking for that department. But thank you for that little introduction. So today I'm going to talk about my book that came out just last month in the beginning of November. And it also happens to be the 60th anniversary of a volcanic event that starts it. But given this is a good intimate group, feel free to ask me questions. I don't have to give it, raise your hand or speak up if you have questions or comments or whatever. So I'm happy to make it a conversation today. So November 14th, 1963, there was an Icelandic fishing boat off the southeast coast of Iceland, and it was dark. The cook got up and smelt something like sulfur, and he nudged the engineer, and they checked the boat, and there was nothing wrong with the boat. And then the water started churning, and then within an hour or two, there was this enormous eruption column from about 400 feet beneath the surface of the ocean. Iceland is on the mid-Atlantic ridge, so it's between the European and North American plates, so it's not unusual to have volcanic activity here. By the end of the day, that column had risen about 300 or 400 feet, and you can see it was attracting lightning at that point. And within a couple of days, the eruption column had reached several miles into the sky, and this island was growing 25 square yards an hour, a minute actually, and about the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza every day. So it was growing very quickly. You could see it from around the southern coast of the island. And it started to attract volcanologists, of course, to see this activity. But early on, Iceland had a great idea. People were interested in tourism in this area, but the biologists that landed there early on suggested that perhaps they could save this island and look at the ecosystems, how the processes occur, what happens, how life comes to an island that is completely free of anything living. So this is what the island looks like in 2021 when I went to visit. It's called Surtsey Island. Surtur is the Nordic god or giant of fire. And you can see that this is the old the volcanoes there, and then the area stretches out. This is stretching out to the north here. So it's now 60 years old, so it just celebrated its 60th birthday, and it's also a UN World Heritage Site. Not because there are younger islands on the planet, but because it's a living lab. Because only about 12 people are allowed on the island, for about 2 weeks, and I was lucky enough to be one of those in 2021. Yeah, please.
Roughly, how long did it take to form this?
Oh yeah, the volcanic activity was about 3 or 4 years, and it's now a lot smaller because so it was growing, and now the erosion is occurring. So this area here, even in just 2 years, is starting to change. And when you're on the island, this northern coast here, you can hear the rock, the boulders falling, right below you. And as a friend of mine said, when Icelanders have nightmares, it's walking on these lava fields because you never really are sure, your next step, where you're going to end up. So they protected this area since the late 1960s, and these are the first 2 birds that were hatched or born on the island in the early 1970s. Erling Olufsen was a young entomologist at that time. And the cool thing is the people that I chatted with, a lot of them are older than the island. So they've been around. Erling can remember seeing the eruption, right? So you're walking on this land, and the land is younger than a lot of the people that are there. So these are the first 2 birds that hatched there. They're black guillemots, seabirds. There were also northern fulmars that year. And already people are thinking, well, what's going to happen when we get birds starting to land on this island? How is that going to change it? The system for many years looked something like this, and this is a relatively recent picture, but only a few plants could survive on most of this island. And those are seaborne plants. So why are the ones that float on the sea more likely to survive? Because they can carry nutrients with them. They can, you think of like a big seed floating in the ocean, it gets to the shore, and then it has enough nitrogen, which is the limiting nutrient here, in order to survive. But you can see only a few of them do. Seeds were coming in from the mainland as well. These are nearby islands, so there were seeds coming through the air, but they couldn't survive because they didn't have enough nitrogen. So they would land, but they wouldn't grow. And the question was, what was going to bring in, how is the nitrogen going to form there? It could take many decades through the atmospheric deposition to occur, but it could also be these winged creatures that are arriving there. So a seabird releases up to 3 ounces of poop per day. And you can see those, you've probably all seen these like cliffs with the guano coming down. And on the areas where they're nesting, so originally you had this guillemots, the fulmars, but now herring gulls, blackback gulls, several species of gulls are coming in, and that's when things really started. They started nesting in that area, and once they nested in large numbers, they started depositing about 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre around that breeding area, right? So that's kind of about what a farmer might use on a field, on their field at any given year, especially for like a permanent grasslands. So this is what it looks like. This is what the breeding area looks like. It has 50 times the biomass of this area here, and you can see that difference from space, right? And this is what the scientists have been studying, is how does that change? What's the diversity of species? There are now, I forget, 70-something plant species that have come to that island. So the birds bring that nitrogen in, but they're also carrying the seeds in their feathers or on their legs because they're flying. Some of them are feeding offshore, where they're bringing those nutrients from fish or from invertebrates. Others are going onto nearby land, bringing those seeds there. So now, every year, you're getting a new couple of species that are coming in, many of them carried by birds. And then once you're getting this diversity of plants, insects are also blowing in, and the birds are bringing in some of the insects. So you have a high insect diversity now, relatively high. Remember, Iceland is in the middle of the ocean. It doesn't have a ton of diversity, but a subset of those are coming in over time. What's amazing here is one of the people I interviewed for this book, working as an ecologist, it's often really hard to know cause. You don't know how long species have been around. You're inferring things about how of these impacts here, they really recorded, they knew some of the plants, individual plants when they arrived. You can't see it here, but you could have seen in that other picture. They marked every plant that arrived, right? So they have a record over time that really is found nowhere else on the planet. And this is a rough timeline of the species, the birds that arrived and the plants. So these sea rockets and sea sandwort, like the name implies, they move their seeds out by maritime through ocean currents. Sheep sorrel arrives. These are two of the early species. Once the gulls come in, that's when there's all these nutrients coming in, and the annual meadow grasses. Kentucky bluegrass, which we're all familiar with, that's one of the species that came there. It's actually European, even though it has the name Kentucky bluegrass, but that's one of the first species to come in once there's lots of nutrients. And then even insectivorous birds are coming in at this point, gray-leg geese, and most recently puffins. And as one of the people I spoke with there, in the future, Surtsey will be the land of the puffin, because it's going to have, if you think of those sharp, very ragged cliff faces, that's from erosion that's occurring there. So eventually it's going to be that puffin, and eventually in 10 or 20,000 years, Surtsey will probably wash away. And then he sort of pauses and said, and then there'll be a new Surtsey, right? Because there'll be another eruption over time. So I've made the case for birds, but it's not just birds. It's also seals. Gray seals, there's a gray seal population that hops on this northern spit, and you can see the green spot right there. And same for the birds. You can clearly see from space. There are a couple of hundred gray seals that are popping in that area. And they're also bringing like bags of fertilizer, basically, in through their feces in that area. Again, changing the way the island looks, and it starts to look more like other islands that have been around longer. And again, they can look at through chemical signatures and see how those nutrients got in there. So this is what Surtsey looks like a year ago or so from, if you do from Google Earth or Google Maps. And this is the breeding bird area right here. You can see clearly, right, there's lots of grass there. It's kind of hard to see in this, but this is the area where the seals are. So clear, evidence for the ecological effects of these species. And then it's the plant cover is much higher in these two areas where the birds are, but also where the seals are. In the absence of animals, you have very few plants. I mean, as an ecologist, you often learn that it's all about plants and microbes, and that's true. They play an essential role, but what I'm trying to make a case in this book is that animals can also play an important role in moving nutrients. We think of plants as the lungs of the planet. Animals are more like the circulatory system. And you can see that here. It's not just this remote island, but it's across the world. So these are from tags that were put on thousands of animals. You can see, right, summer's coming in the north, right? So animals are moving north, either in North America, most clearly through Europe. And this is happening every year. It's as consistent, right, as the Earth's orbit around the sun. These animals are moving back and forth. They're bringing nutrients either in the form of feces or urine or in their carcasses, right? So they're moving those nutrients across the way.
Can you explain how the insects came to Surtsey?
Oh, how the insects got there, sure. I mean, so it would be two ways. And right now, for plants, I think 2/3 of plants they think came from birds, right? And a lot of the insects also could have come on the feathers of the birds, or they were carried on the birds, or they floated in. So, you know what, through wind. Probably, I don't think any would have made it through the ocean. So those would be the two main pathways.
So with
yeah.
this that you just showed us here,
Yeah.
is this all birds, like tag, like, are all these?
These are
Is everyone
birds,
using
they're
data
also
points?
they're whales, turtles.
Oh.
This is a group called Move Bank, which they're collecting all the tagged animals across the planet and showing it over time. Yeah, I mean, I think this to me is really one of the best ways to visualize what we're talking about when we're talking about how these animals move. And they're adding new animals all the time. You know what, I think and they know some of the individuals, right? There's a crane that's flying back and forth that they've been following for years. We put tags on whales as well. So it gives you an idea of how animals are moving each year. So I'll read a little bit about this process. It wasn't that long ago that animals were dismissed by many scientists as bit players on the planet. Plants and microbes took center stage. But in the past decade or so, there's been a radical shift in our understanding of how the world is shaped by predators and herbivores. Landmark studies of seabirds, whales, sea otters, salmon, cicadas, and other animals have shown that they can alter the landscapes and seascapes where they live, with major impacts on ecological function and the services these animals provide. Much of this remains unseen. Few people realize that when they recline on the white sands of Hawaii and other tropical beaches, they are lying in the waste of parrotfish, the poop from coral reefs. Animals matter. Creatures, sometimes with fur or scales, sometimes red in tooth and claw, perhaps with talons and wings, wild and free roaming, are a fundamental mechanism of sustaining life and a source for the nutrients it requires. It's only after thousands of years of serial depletion by our species that scientists are beginning to understand the interconnectedness of these energy transfers. Follow the nutrients. The essential elements of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus move in geologic time, carried by gravity, wind, and currents, downhill, downwind, downstream. If they reach the deep sea, phosphate and ammonia molecules can be locked away in the ocean depths for hundreds of years unless they hit an area of upwelling, where waters are drawn to the surface. Such areas are rare in the ocean. There is another way for these vital nutrients to move thousands of feet up the water column. They can catch a ride in the belly of a whale. Foraging sperm whales feed on giant squid and other deep-sea creatures, but they must return to the surface at least once an hour for a postprandial breath of air. There they rest, digest, and often release enormous fecal plumes, rich in phosphates, nitrogen, and iron. The nutrients of the plumes can be picked up by phytoplankton and consumed by zooplankton, such as krill and tiny copepods. The krill or their fish predators might then be consumed by seabirds, gulls, fulmars, terns, penguins, petrels, and airlifted to the breeding grounds. Back at their nests, the birds feed their young by vomiting up their sea meals and excrete nitrogen-rich uric acid, the striking white paste that is released along with feces onto the land. We can follow these elements from the deep sea to the coasts, rivers, forests, savannas, and mountains of the world. A geological journey that would take thousands or millions of years. The tectonic plates beneath Iceland move at a rate of approximately 1.5 inches per year, about the speed of growing fingernails. Can be reversed in a single dive, a short flight back to a barren rock, and a Pollock-like spatter. Animals are the beating heart of the planet. In the same way that trees work as the Earth's lungs, inhaling carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen, animals pump nitrogen and phosphorus from deep-sea gorges up to mountain peaks and across hemispheres from the poles to the tropics. Trillions of animals live the traveling life. They fly, run, swim, walk, even dig. Large and medium-sized animals, whales, elephants, bison, salmon, and seabirds, can move nutrients hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. These long-distance travelers are the world's arteries. Cicadas, midges, krill, and other invertebrates are the world's, if we take this idea a step further, are the capillaries, delivering nutrients to Earth's tissues. Ecosystems are living things, emerging, maturing, dying, and even in death, they add richness to the web of life. Animals have major influences in these systems and the geochemical cycles that humans and all life forms count on for survival. So, excuse me, one of the biggest migratory movements on the planet occurs every day, and it also occurs here in Lake Champlain, but especially in the oceans, and it's daily vertical migration, with animals, zooplankton coming to the surface to feed at night, and then migrating down to hide from predation during the day. And they're moving back and forth, trillions of organisms every day. Back when I was doing my master's degree at the University of Florida, I learned about this basic concept in the ocean, which is called the biological pump. which is, of course, photosynthesis can only occur when there's light, so any of the phytoplankton that are going to be producing are near the surface. But when they die, or when they're fed on by fish or krill or other invertebrates, when they're moving back and forth, they can either die or they can also release feces, and most of the organic matter is going to sink, right? So this is the basic process that we see all the time and that we've learned about for decades. But when I was hearing about this from my professor in marine ecology in 1997, I think it was, I had just spent a summer on the water in the Bay of Fundy off the coast of Nova Scotia, and I realized something was missing here. And about 10 years ago, I was really surprised to find my notes from that day when I was listening to that lecture. I think we were insulating our attic at that time, and we were taking things out, and I found a notebook. I had forgotten that I had actually drawn the process there. I had been studying right whales, North Atlantic right whales, that summer, and one of the first ones I saw came to the surface to breathe, and it had mud on its bonnet because it had been diving several hundred feet beneath the surface to feed, coming to the surface where they have to breathe, rest, and poop. One of the first whales I ever saw, there was this large fecal plume about as big as the boat in front of us. At that point, they were collecting it to look at what they were eating, eventually hormones, also DNA analysis, and then when I went back a few years later looking at nitrogen levels and phosphorus levels and looking to see were these whales actually having, how big was an impact was. So right whales are feeding, they're coming to the surface, it's picked up by phytoplankton, and then consumed by copepods, which is the food for the whales. There are sadly only about 350 right whales on the planet, so I knew even at that time, probably not a huge impact, very few animals, but what about when there were 10,000 whales, right? What about when whales were much more common, much more abundant? And I was a graduate student, and I also reminded myself to eat there, so 12 to 20. So it took about a decade, that wasn't part of my master's work, to find a biological oceanographer, Jim McCarthy, who would be willing to entertain this idea, because it really, if you know biological oceanography, it's very much focused on microbes and very small phytoplankton and maybe some zooplankton. Whales are mostly ignored. Jim amazingly was willing to entertain this idea that maybe whales matter, right? Let's quantify it. As one of my colleagues said, is it ecologically important or is it a fart in a hurry, right? And we were looking at that, right? How important is it? So this is that basic idea. There's the biological pump, very familiar, and here's the whale pump. So we built a model and found that in the Gulf of Maine, so here off New England, whales bring as much nitrogen to the surface as all the rivers combined. So we're thinking, okay, that's showing some evidence that they have an impact, and about right now they have about an equal impact to humans, the amount of sewage. We put a lot of sewage out into there, right? But in the past, whales would have been much more abundant. Humans, before human exploitation, that's when they would really have an impact. So what we're looking at now is, what could restoration mean? So we pitched this idea, and we submitted it, and Popular Science picked up the idea that it was one of the worst jobs in science. And I'll push back against that, and I'll make my case now that it isn't. And that, this stuff can be kind of beautiful. Popular Science once called whale feces researcher one of the worst jobs in science, but I didn't see it that way. Whale fecal plumes can be neon green or bright red. There are floating bricks and leather brown stools. At times they sparkle with scales like the sun glinting on the water. Every whale defecation is unique. I found that snowflakes were miracles of beauty, Wilson Bentley wrote, after photographing thousands of crystals at his home in Jericho, Vermont. Every crystal was a masterpiece of design, and no one design was ever repeated. You all know Snowflake, that famous room, of course. It might be pushing it to say that a whale's fecal plume is the symmetry and beauty of a snow crystal, but no two poops are alike. When whales are feeding on lipid-rich crustaceans, their poops tend to float and clump into bright red flocculent feces. When they feed on fish, their poops can be more subtle, a cloud of unknowing, like oversteeped green tea. One afternoon, we noticed a huge vertical spout off the stern of our Zodiac. The sound was as deep as a foghorn, Glints of stainless steel flashed off a slate blue flank that arched above the water. A finback, large and fast, passed us like a bullet train, ending with a relatively tiny dorsal fin. There in the fluke print, a pinkish plume, krill. The smell varies too. When feeding on fish, humpbacks and fins have poops that smell relatively mild, like brine with a hint of sulfur. Poops from krill or copepod meals are stinkier, and the plumes of the North Atlantic right whale are the foulest of them all. A stench so thick that if it gets on your clothes, it'll never go away. And when we looked at feces, what did we find? There were high levels of ammonia, a nitrogen compound found in animal waste, in all the fecal plumes. This nitrogen could be picked up by the phytoplankton, and there were also high levels of phosphorus, another essential nutrient. Whales are common in the Gulf of Maine in summer, which is when it matters most. The pump fertilizes phytoplankton when the thermocline keeps many of the nutrients locked away in the depths. The algae feed the zooplankton and fish, and they in turn feed the whales. It's a positive feedback loop. More whales lead to more fish. The life cycle is fundamentally the same for any creature. If you follow an animal long enough, it will poop. Eventually it will die. But even when you follow whales all day long, their feces can be a challenge to find and an even bigger challenge to collect. One afternoon, a fin whale swam toward us off the island of Grand Manan in the Bay of Fundy. Just before the whale dived, I saw a shimmer of white, the scales from a recent fish meal. By the time we got there, it was gone, the poop that got away. So how to improve our chances? Colleagues of mine had a brilliant idea in the late 1990s, and that is to use scout detecting dogs to find whale feces at sea. This is Fargo, a 90-pound Rottweiler. Started his career as a companion dog for an elderly woman when she went to assisted living. He started as a drug sniffing dog in a prison in Washington State, and that was for a few years. Then he got what I think for a lot of dogs would be a dream job, which is wildlife detecting dog. Right? And so he's looked for grizzly scats as well as wolverines and scats of different animals in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering, so with all the plastic in the oceans now, how would you find that affecting whale feces?
The feces. It's found, unfortunately, microplastic has been found in whale feces. And more disturbing, I work on a highly endangered species called the Gulf of Mexico whale, the Rice's whale. And one of them has died by ingesting a piece of plastic about the size of a credit card. And think about how we're going to battle that. So plastic, absolutely huge issue, and I've been teaching marine ecology where I never spoke about it when I started teaching it, and now it becomes an important part of conservation, ocean conservation, is figuring out ways, one, of course, mostly to reduce putting any more additional plastic in, and then second.
But you can talk to people about how it's in the whales. I mean, that seems like it's a really important thing to let people know. Just
it absolutely is, and there is a picture, if you want to look it up, that's very sad. A sperm whale had stranded, and they took all the plastic out, and they put it across a tennis court, and it covers, I think, the tennis court. All the plastic left, just that part of the picture. So, excuse me. Fargo was incredibly effective at finding these scats. I mean, if you think about how dogs work on land, if you watch the dog on a scent trail, it's sallying upstream, right? You go back and forth upwind. On land, oceans are easier in that you don't have trees, you don't have hills, but they're also really hard because you can't run in the water. And unfortunately for Fargo, he was subject to seasickness, so he actually took Dramamine for everyone. But this is when you see these black boxes, he's aware, he's smelling it, he's very excited. And then going upwind, there's the X, so he's no longer smelling it, so he's relaxed, and they know they're off the trail, so the boat driver's going in, he's hitting it again, and then he's out, and then they're going upwind, and this is when humans can smell it. And I said it's a very strong smell. We can smell it over 100 yards. But Fargo is finding it a nautical mile away. So he's finding these samples, tripling the amount of samples that could be collected in a day. And that allowed us to do not only these the nutrient analyses that I've been working on, but also looking at effects of stress levels on whales, and they're affected by ocean noises, as well as lots of studies. You don't really have to touch a whale anymore. All you need to do is find their fecal plumes. So dogs have been a really important part, conservation tool, and now one of the challenges for finding fecal plumes when you're on board is you're relatively low to the water, so looking out you can't really see below water. So one of the things that's really opened this up has been drone technology. And now you're seeing that drone up top. This is a fin whale in the Gulf of California, and they're putting a suction cup tag on this fin whale. And so it's basically just some silicone that's holding on there, and that allows us to follow that whale for hours and up to a day. And it's much less stressful for the whale, because the other way to do it is you got to get close. You have to deploy it on the back of the whale. Now you don't even have to approach it. You see that whale there, it didn't really react at all to that whale. So, and the other nice thing is with drones, you can see from above, so you're also getting another way of view. So it enhances our chances of collecting these plumes. I talked a lot about poop, but it's also about carcasses, whale carcasses. Dead whales, when they fall in the deep sea, they're called whale falls. And it brings an enormous amount of food and nitrogen and carbon into the deep sea. The deep sea does not have a lot of nutrients. There's not a lot of growth there. But when a whale falls, it's equivalent to more than 1,000 years of that biological pump that I showed you, right? So because it's this one big pulse that lands there, and they're bringing not only nitrogen, phosphorus, especially carbon, there's soft tissue, and then there's sulfur in the bones of these whales. And whale bones are enormous. So there's a succession of species across time. First, you have scavengers that are coming in, taking that soft tissue, and then you have species like this Osedax worm, or bone-eating worm, that's landing on these bones, and you can see a lot of them there. And there are also some sea cucumbers around the edges as well. These Osedax stands out in this book in that they don't have a mouth, they don't have a gut, they don't have an anus, so they're not doing the processes that we're taught that are the title of the book, but they're bringing those nutrients in, and they have bacteria that are internal chemosynthetic bacteria, symbiotic bacteria that are providing the nutrients. So they're giving the bacteria the basics, the sulfur, the carbon, the nitrogen, and then they're producing the sugars and the amino acids and other things that these animals need. A couple of years ago, as Renee said, I was on a Kolbert in Iceland, a Fulbright fellowship, and from the last day I had to give an exit seminar. And what I did today, I usually get up in the morning, early in the morning, and think about what I'm going to talk about that day. And I put the slide together. I realized that my entire career could really boil down to 3 words. That is eat, poop, die. I also look at pee, and if you want it, we can talk about that later. Didn't quite work as much as the title. But that morning, I was like, and that should be like the title of my next book, because it's what I've been doing for the past few decades. And then the book came out just last month. So it was about a 4-year process, from idea to pitching to write to doing research. And one of the wonderful things about this is not only in places like Iceland, but also to Hawaii and Alaska, and and here in New England as well, thinking about these processes. Lots of species to talk about, but I do have to give you at least one reality check, which in Vermont we probably would realize is that most animals on the planet are not the wild animals that I've been talking about. It's really amazing. So 60% of mammal biomass on the planet is livestock, is cows, is sheep, is or goats, pigs. And more than a third are us. So we make up more than a third of all the mammals on the planet, and only 4% are wild animals. That includes the whales that I just showed you, and that includes a lot of the species that we might see every day. Anybody know what the most abundant wild mammal is on the planet right now in biomass? Any guesses?
Cats.
Well, yeah, it's ones that we see. White-tailed deer actually is number 1, and that fin whale I showed you just before is number 2. So white-tailed deer, have come back spectacularly, and they're few, but they're still, when you compare it to what else is there, my work as a conservation biologist is to try, in my whatever small way, to think about the future for these mammals, that there might be one that where we can restore these pathways that we've been talking about. Similarly for birds, 70% of birds are the chickens and turkeys that we have. So that's the bummer. The good news is we have changed some things in relatively short time. This is work that I've been working on with colleagues, what we call lifting baselines. The idea is that things can change even in our lifetimes. And if any of you have been to Cape Cod over the years, you might have noticed some changes on Cape Cod with the gray seals coming back and then white sharks coming back, right? Something that no one would have remembered gray seals being there abundant at all, because it would have been many decades ago. Here's like a good story that I think of as northern elephant seals. So in this picture right here, which is a colleague of mine took, there's probably more elephant seals than there were in the entire world in 1900. They had been decimated. And now there are almost 180,000. And that's because Mexico and the US made an agreement to protect these species. And so you can bring these species back to ecological relevance in a relatively, 100 years. That's a relatively quick time for species like that. I grew up in New York City. As you mentioned, King Kong was an influence. I never saw whales or dolphins around New York City growing up. But now when I go back and visit my mom, they're there. It's amazing. So they're common dolphins now. They're humpback whales. This isn't photoshopped. There are, ospreys and bald eagles are back. So in a short time, in 50 years, a lot of species that really seem to have been gone have returned. And that's because of some really good legislation, right? One is the Clean Water Act. The oceans are a lot cleaner around the cities. This would be true in Boston too. In the course of 50 years. Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, which is going to be 50 this month, and I'm talking about that tomorrow in Richmond if anyone wants to go. I won't be talking about this book. And the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act. So all of those together really can be effective and in a short time. So these kind of laws can make a difference across a couple of generations. Yeah.
How will climate change affect all that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It will definitely have an impact. And we can talk about, since I've mentioned and showed pictures of the North Atlantic right whale, for example, it's a very good example. So Bay of Fundy, when I was doing my research, that was where they fed every summer. They still feed off Cape Cod. They're no longer there. They've moved to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, off of Canada, further north. They're following those copepods, that prey there. And that caused, because they moved out of a relatively protected area into an area where they were not protected because they were never there, several of them got caught in snow crab lines, and it was probably the worst year for right whales at that time. So it was a combination of, one, they didn't have a lot of food, and then also put them at risk again. Those kind of movements are meaning we're going to have to do adaptive we're going to be having to watch this every year to see how things change. It's not going to help, to say the least. However, we have seen these trends go up, and we can do everything we can to protect them as they're moving across this way. There has been some work showing that there are some connections between rewilding and restoring species and climate solutions. One example would be wildebeests in Africa. There was a die-off about 50 years ago from distemper, and most of the wildebeest disappeared. And as a result of the loss of grazing, there were lots more fires, so a lot of carbon was released into the atmosphere. Some estimates say that now that wildebeest are basically restored in the system, fires are fewer because of the grazing, and that's keeping more carbon in the ground. And there have been several studies, whether it's for whales and others. This is work that I'm actively interested in, and I will just be transparent that I think animals aren't going to solve the climate crisis in any way. That's going to be up to us, but they can be one tool in the kit, especially when we're thinking about resiliency and protecting biodiversity. In that way, I think they can be very helpful. And this is a great example. This is the humphead parrotfish. They feed mostly on dead corals, and they grind it up, and this is the fecal plume there at sand. All right, so I think numbers for Hawaii, like 80% of the sand there is biogenic, has been through a fish or has been in some way released that way. It's not like here, if we go to the beach here, a lot of that is going to be geological based, but there are throughout many of the tropics. These guys, excuse me, just 3 parrotfish of this size can deliver a concrete mixer's worth of sand to the beach each year. And there, in that case, my colleagues have estimated, and by the way, they're connected to seabirds, because what they've shown is when you have rats on an island, you have fewer seabirds, and that means fewer nutrients are getting into that system. When you take rats out of the system, seabirds go up, more nutrients, not only on the islands, but also the coral systems around there. So the fish are growing faster in those areas, and bigger, and releasing more of the sands in that system. And by their estimates, it might be able to keep up with climate change. If you have enough fish in that area, those islands are accreting naturally. So they can be an important ally in the fight of against climate change. I haven't spoken a lot about insects, but I did visit Mývatn, or Midge Lake in Iceland for this trip, and this is Claudia Grotten, who I interviewed. In the trillions, the midges come up. Not every year, it's not like cicadas, which are every 17 years, it's a bit more dynamic. But when their larvae are formed in the lake, and then they breed over the grasslands there. And Claudia was really excited to tell locals, wow, when they come out there, you can see that these nutrients from the dead midges are getting into the grasses. And he gave this presentation to the local farmers, like, yeah, we knew this. We have a term for it. It's called mealgrass and midgegrass, right? So, and this could have been really important. Iceland was really poor, couldn't bring food in at that point. You depended on your sheep that were feeding on those grasses. So they knew very intricately when, the impacts of these midges in those areas. And then back to those seabirds, there's been some interesting studies showing that the ammonia that's released from the guano forms sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. That unites with water, and that creates cloud seed droplets. So when you're near some of these areas, we're often seeing clouds forming around that area, and that could have an albedo effect, reflecting sunlight and heat back into the atmosphere. Again, this will be important probably on a local scale. I don't think seabird poop isn't going to save the world, but it can be, and again, an important tool for that. So it's not only getting into those areas, but also into the atmosphere. So for me, my dream is to try and think aspirationally some world in the future where wild animals again play a role, that they're moving around the planet, and that we're going to learn new things, new ways of interactions in those ecosystems, just like we've learned for whales and for seabirds in a few years. There's a new concept called zoogeochemistry. It's basically biogeochemistry for animals, right? And I think we're at the very beginning now to get that idea. So my dream is, can we replace our carbon footprint with the tracks of wild animals? And with that, I'm happy to chat, open to questions. Thank you.
Could you say that one more time? What was I just?
Oh, sure. Let's replace our carbon footprint with the tracks of wild animals. And this is a picture from Surtsey Island, where you have the birds, and where the human footprint is very small. So much so that one year on Surtsey, they found a new plant that they couldn't identify. And they brought it to the botanist, and he's like, oh yeah, this is a tomato plant. It was near the human latrine, right? So at that point, they took that one out, and now you go to the bathroom at the very end, during low tide at the edge of the waves. So yeah.
Where do domesticated animals fit into this whole thing? Cats, dogs, all of our pets.
Right.
When you were talking about livestock and wild, I was wondering where our pets fit.
They're not in that particular number. They're not as I forget the number, but it's not as large as the animals that we eat, which are the dominant ones, especially the large herbivores. the only thing that comes to mind for the book is what we have a dog. And so she would allow me every day to think about pooping and peeing, and so I was very much cued into that system. And the nitrogen that when dogs pee, they're releasing a lot of nitrogen. And of course, we're feeding them food from away. Most of us are buying that food. So there have been studies showing that areas where there are a lot of people walking their dogs, you see a lot of nitrogen going into that system. So they are playing a role in this. Not as large a role as as cows or large farms. And there is some debate in the book about what's the best way to manage domestic animals. Is it silviculture, allowing the animals, thinking of a wildlife-friendly way, or is it containment? And what is the best way? I think that's still very much an open debate. And what the future is for lab-based meats as well. We'll see.
How much of a role do you see this kind of research playing as like a bargaining chip for like increasing conservation efforts for specific species? You mentioned the right whale. Just how far along is it in that sort of process?
I think it's an important, it's giving us an increased view of when you restore animals, what the impact is on on the diversity of the ecosystems entirely. Again, a lot of it previously, the animals sort of were looked at as passengers. They were sort of coming along, they didn't have a large impact. Excuse me. Now that we're focusing on what happens if you restore a mountain lion to Vermont, for example, there will be lots of impact. Or if you return wild turkeys, which weren't here, long ago, what are the impacts? So I think that's really what we're learning is the effects. We can restore natural movement of phosphorus and nitrogen. And here's a question in Vermont practically, right? What would the restoration of beavers, anadromous fish, and herbivores to the phosphorus cycle? And we propose that that's one way of getting phosphorus back uphill. We're always thinking everything's going downhill, right? Animals actually can be moving it, especially in the form of fish, can be moving those nutrients uphill. So they can do a lot. And the other nice thing is once you get those large numbers, you don't have, as humans, we don't have to put inputs in. They'll reproduce on their own.
Yeah, I'm really interested in looking at historical ecosystem change and to really think about the fact that what we see today, isn't what was, and we're experiencing shifting baselines. So I'm wondering how we can study or perhaps use sediment cores of feces to look into the past and what does nutrient cycling look like when whales were more abundant or when they were starting to decline. What is the extinction of a species, or what happens to the ecosystem and nutrient cycling when a species goes extinct, for instance?
Absolutely. So yeah, there are some ways of getting at that. One is coral systems, which can live a long time. So you can be looking at the chemical signatures in corals, for example, or in plants, or in sediments, right? So those are three ways. Again, the system is, there are a lot of things going on at once, right? That's why the seabird stories, they really are the ambassadors for this. The idea of having rats on some islands and not changes everything. And I try and do that for whales. We have systems with whales and without whales, but there are human activities, there's a lot of things going on, so it's hard to pull out what the role of the whales were. Though we have looked at, one inference is as whales declined, primary productivity in some areas went down. We don't know if it was the whales, but it could be that whales had some impact on that system. I think for us, for the whales in particular, it's probably looking at coral systems like in Hawaii and seeing, the good news is, in that case, it's a lifting baseline in that in the 1970s, we often forget, whales were all close to extinction. And they're, in some places, humpback whales are as abundant as they ever have been. So looking at that change is promising.
What inspired you to write books as opposed to staying within your academic, you know, field and publishing in journals, and how has that impacted you?
A couple of things I can think of. One is, although it's hard, it's when you have an idea, like that whale pup idea I had in 1997, I didn't publish it for at least 10 years. Because one, I wasn't focused on that, and then two, I had to find somebody, you know, so, and then you have to get some funding, so it takes a decade or more for an idea. Whereas with a book, like I mentioned, I had this idea for, you know, 300-page book 4 years ago, and the thing was, as it happens there, I mean, I went to Alaska to see salmon, so it's the excitement and curiosity that this allows me to do, and to meet with people who have been working on these systems. So that's one motivation. The other, of course, is I'm often talking to different people here, you know, at the library, as opposed to at UVM or something where it's giving an academic seminar. Because I'm a conservation biologist, my goal, you know, I have a goal just like, well, you're a doctor, you told me, you know, or a public health person. Clearly you have your patient's best interest. For me, I have the interests of wildlife in mind, and in that sense, I have to speak to politicians, to the public, to policymakers, and this is one way that I learned how to give voice to that. So probably that's two of probably many reasons, but the first two that came to mind. But you'll see, if you look at my CV, there's always like this year's, the 2023 was not very good for my publication record, because I was working on the book, and I wasn't really focused on that. So.
I just remember the New York Times had an article, it was called Bug Armageddon, and just how the bug populations have really, really gone down. And I remember as a girl, I mean, we always had a lot of bug, you know, swish bugs on our windshields and all. So I know we spray around the towns and all, but that has implications for all creatures that eat bugs, including birds, right?
Yeah.
So could you speak to that a little bit? Where are we on the status with bugs?
Yeah, certainly I think many populations that have been studied have gone down in the past couple of decades. Here in Vermont, one we can think of is monarch butterflies. Anyone that's been around long enough has probably seen population decline in that case. And there's one that's really also like the whales. They're traveling huge distances, right, that are funneling down into these small areas. The impacts on any animals that are feeding on insects.
We don't see large flocks of birds anymore, really.
Interesting, yeah.
Right?
So it certainly has wide-ranging impacts, not only for the insects themselves, but also for the ecosystems. One of the chapters in the book is about the 17-year cicada, which just came up in 2021, not this far north, but in the mid-Atlantic. And a friend of mine remembers 17 years ago, they had a block party in August, and they had to cancel it because the cicada carcasses were like waist deep. They didn't have any of this past year, though. Yeah, I mean, they've seen a change, and I grew up on Long Island, and they're gone from almost all of Long Island as well. That's probably land change is our best guess. I don't know if it has to do with insecticides. It might too. But when you have them, when they're abundant, it's amazing. I don't know if any of you have been through like one of those 17-year cicadas, but I was down in Annapolis where they're still quite abundant. We couldn't hear each other. It's that loud, and it changes the birds, how all the animals that are feeding on insects, all of a sudden just start focusing on the cicadas, and then they can't keep up because the cicadas are so abundant. So it actually has impacts on the forest. We can study that because it's so rare, and we call it hot spots and hot moments. That's a hot moment. You can see it, it's clear as day. Unfortunately, with a lot of insects and other invertebrates, it kind of goes beneath the radar. So I think we're just starting to understand what the widespread impacts are beyond the question of that biodiversity.
What projects are you working on now?
Oh, yeah. So I don't think I spoke about this. The main project Thursday that I have an all-day meeting, two things, but one is what I call the Great Whale Conveyor Belt. So I was talking about this whale pump idea going up and down. the whales also migrate thousands of miles every year from, let's think of, from Iceland down to the Caribbean. They feed in the north, and then they breed in the tropical systems, and they're bringing nutrients there because they're on the high latitudes because there's lots of food. And in that case, it's actually pee and placentas and carcasses because the females are going there to have their calves and to nurse, and that is incredibly metabolically expensive. So they're breaking down their blubber and they're releasing those nutrients out into the system. And we're finding that that's comparable to the amount of nutrients that are already moving into that system. So they're basically doubling the amount of nitrogen into those areas. So that's one of those ones that I submitted when I was working really hard on the book and haven't had a chance to revise. So that's next up. And the other question is really looking at the impact of rewilding on the carbon cycle. In that case, I am a bit more skeptic. I feel like the claims that we might hear in the media that whales are worth $3 million as climate warriors, unfortunately, I don't think the evidence is there. I think I've hinted at that, but that's another one is we're trying to get an idea of what exactly is the role. It's very much a local impact. It's clear. Global impacts. Yeah.
Is there anybody studying what you're studying of the carbon impact and the climate cost benefit on older rewilding, like bringing the wolves back to Yellowstone and programs like that? You know, you hear about the ranchers are upset and the ecosystem is flourishing, but what you're talking about, I don't hear anything about that.
There are a couple of studies and I talk about it in the book. It's a debate. You know, I tell students you don't go into science for facts because I mean you don't go there. Maybe you're going there for the questions, and that was one. So the story, if you go to Yellowstone and you'll see a plaque there, is the wolf effect. Wolves came back, and they affected they hunted elk and and bison, but largely they were hunting elk. And the elk populations around that time declined, but also what's proposed is this idea of a landscape of fear, that they would typically be browsing because they don't have anything to worry about. When the wolves returned, they weren't browsing as much because they had to pay attention whether there were wolves around, right? Especially if they had calves. And there are still colleagues of mine who very much believe that, and there are others who question the data and that, but it is true that at that time, the landscape changed, and in that system, it didn't result in necessarily more carbon, but in the nearby forests, there is one claim at least that when wolves are there, more carbon is sequestered in those areas because you're taking out some of the herbivores in that area. So if the herbivore population goes down, I think there's not much argument. The question is how much the wolves are impacting the behavior of those animals, and that's very much sort of a hot topic. But yes, there has been work on that as well as on mountain lions. They have what is described as kill gardens. So when they kill something and they're feeding on it, there's a big bunch of nutrients there, and those nutrients can feed the grasses, go to the grasses, which again bring in more herbivores. So it may be working positively for species like mountain lions by having those carcasses around, having this nutrient cycling, that they're getting more food and they're attracting more. Right. Looks like we're just at the top of the hour, so I'm happy to answer questions personally or anything like that. Thank you all for coming.
You said you were speaking somewhere.